Maxwell's weathered hands trembled as he stared at the letter on the kitchen table, afternoon light casting long shadows across the polished wood. His coffee grew cold beside him, its familiar aroma now mingling with the salt of silent tears. The Thanksgiving turkey preparations abandoned, he traced a finger over the paper's edge. Memories of family gatherings, laughter, shared meals, trusted bonds, now tainted by the betrayal revealed in neat, emotionless handwriting. Has someone's betrayal ever shattered your world? Share your story in the comments. Like if this moment touches your heart, follow to see how Maxwell finds strength after this crushing blow. His throat tightened as a single tear splashed onto the letter, blurring the ink. The grandfather clock ticked in the hallway, marking precious moments now forever changed. A small noise from the doorway pulled his attention. His 9-year-old daughter Emma, watching, eyes wiser than her years. Maxwell's weathered hands paused over the Thanksgiving turkey recipe. The kitchen, usually a place of comfort, felt different today. Something in Thelma's note about his inadequate cooking plans had struck deeper than her usual criticisms. He traced the handwriting with his fingertip, noticing an odd flourish on the signature that didn't match her usual script. His throat tightened. 37 years married, and he knew her handwriting like his own reflection. The afternoon light filtered through lace curtains, casting long shadows across the counter. From the hallway, the steady tick of his grandfather's clock counted seconds in the heavy silence. A photograph on the refrigerator caught his eye. Last year's Thanksgiving, before Emma's eyes had grown so watchful, before Thelma's family had started their campaign of subtle undermining. A single tear formed. Maxwell wiped it quickly with the back of his hand. "Just tired," he whispered to the empty kitchen, though no one had asked. He returned to the recipe, hands steadier now. In his decades as a mechanic, he'd learned that precision reveals truth, in engines and in people. Something wasn't fitting right in this household, hadn't been for months. The way Thelma's family exchanged glances when they thought he wasn't looking. The hushed phone conversations that stopped when he entered rooms. The tear he'd fought returned with reinforcements. This time, he let one fall, watching it splash onto the recipe card, blurring the ink slightly. The turkey would still be perfect, he'd make sure of that. His dignity remained in the things he could control. Maxwell's fingers brushed against the handkerchief in his pocket, the one Emma had given him last Father's Day. "For when things get dusty, Dad," she'd said, with that serious look that seemed too old for her 9 years. Had she seen? Had she noticed the changes too? He was folding the recipe card when he spotted it, a smudge where there shouldn't be one, as if someone had erased and rewritten a portion of the note. His mechanic's eye, trained to spot imperfections that might cause an engine to fail, couldn't unsee it now. Maxwell's chest tightened. Trust, like an old engine, needed all parts working together. One compromised component could cause the whole system to break down. A soft noise from the doorway pulled his attention. Emma stood watching, her small frame silhouetted against the hallway light. "Dad?" she said quietly. "Are you okay?" Maxwell squared his shoulders and tucked away his suspicions with his handkerchief. "Just fine, sweetheart, just fine." His voice betrayed him with the slightest crack. Maxwell watched Emma's eyes, too knowing for a child her age, as she stepped fully into the kitchen. She carried her small backpack, clutching it closer than usual. "The relatives are coming soon," she said, not a question, but a warning. The grandfather clock in the hall chimed 4, marking the dwindling hours before Thelma's family would descend upon them. Maxwell nodded, folding Thelma's note and slipping it into his pocket. The evidence of tampering would keep for now. "Your mother's upstairs getting ready," he said, voice steadier than he felt. "Would you like to help me with the stuffing?" Emma placed her backpack carefully on a kitchen chair before washing her hands. The careful way she positioned it, slightly open with something black visible inside, didn't escape Maxwell's notice. Another oddity in a house collecting them like dust. As they worked side by side, Maxwell's mind returned to last month's family dinner. Thelma's sister leaning close, whispering, "He's getting forgetful, isn't he?" Thelma's practiced sigh of concern. "We're managing." The exchange of glances that carried weight beyond their words. He wasn't forgetful. And his hands could still rebuild a carburetor blindfolded. The doorbell rang at 5:30. Thelma's voice called from upstairs. "Maxwell, get that!" "Ready?" Emma asked softly, small hand briefly touching his. Maxwell straightened his collar, practiced a smile that wouldn't reach his eyes, and moved toward the front door. The first arrivals were Thelma's parents, her mother's jewelry clinking as she air-kissed his cheek. "Maxwell, dear, you look tired," she said, eyes evaluating rather than concerned. "Is everything all right?" "Just fine, Margaret," he replied, the lie settling like a stone in his stomach. More arrivals followed. Thelma's sister and her husband, 2 cousins, an aunt. Each greeting accompanied by subtle scrutiny, each conversation punctuated with pregnant pauses when he spoke. When Thelma finally descended, radiant in a new dress he hadn't seen before, the room's energy shifted toward her like flowers to the sun. In the bathroom, Maxwell splashed cold water on his face. The mirror reflected a man he sometimes struggled to recognize, still strong, but with something diminished in his eyes. A tear threatened. He blinked it back. 37 years of marriage, and he'd become a stranger in his own home. He returned to find Emma in a corner, watching the adults with that unnerving focus. As he passed, she slipped something from her pocket into her backpack. The movement was subtle, practiced. The telephone rang. Maxwell answered, finding his sister on the line. "Jane," he said, relief warming his voice. "Are you still coming for—" "I'm sorry, Max," she interrupted. "Thelma called yesterday. Said you weren't feeling up to a full house. That you'd been confused lately." Maxwell's grip tightened on the receiver, another piece shifting out of place. "That's not true, Jane." "Well, she was quite concerned, and—" His gaze found Thelma across the room, laughing with her family. She met his eyes briefly, her smile never faltering. "I'll call you tomorrow," he said quietly, hanging up. Returning to the gathering, Maxwell noticed Emma watching him, her small notepad now visible in her lap, writing something, watching everything. The dining room gleamed under chandelier light. Thelma's family arranged around the table like chess pieces. Maxwell carried in the turkey, golden brown and perfect despite the morning's criticisms. A momentary hush fell as he placed it at the center. "Well," Thelma's mother said, breaking the silence, "it certainly looks better than last year's dried-out attempt." Polite laughter rippled around the table. Maxwell took his seat at the end opposite Thelma, noticing how Emma had positioned herself between them, her backpack now tucked beneath her chair. Dinner proceeded with the rhythm of tradition corrupted by undercurrents. Each compliment on the food came with qualifications: surprising or better than expected. Stories were shared, carefully excluding Maxwell or recasting him as comic relief. The time he'd gotten lost driving to the lake house, the investment advice he'd ignored that would have made a fortune. The turkey was half consumed when Thelma's brother-in-law raised his glass. "To family," he said, "and to Thelma for taking such good care of everyone, especially Maxwell. We all see how patient you are." Something shifted in Maxwell's chest. The room seemed to narrow, the chandelier light suddenly harsh. "Patient?" he repeated, voice quiet but firm. Thelma's smile tightened. "Robert's just being kind, dear." "No," Maxwell set down his fork. "I'd like to understand what he means by patient." The table fell silent. Emma sat perfectly still beside him, her hand moving slightly toward her backpack. "Well," Robert continued, uncomfortable but committed, "we all know how things have been. The incidents, the confusion." "What incidents?" Maxwell asked, each word measured. Thelma laughed lightly. "Maxwell, this isn't the time." "It's exactly the time." His voice remained steady. "For months now, there've been whispers, phone calls that stop when I enter rooms. My own sister was told not to come today because I'm supposedly confused." Thelma's mother tutted. "Perhaps this proves the point." Maxwell looked around the table, at faces that had been family for decades. "I've rebuilt engines that mechanics half my age couldn't diagnose. I balanced our investments through 2 recessions. I can still quote word for word the poem I wrote for our 30th anniversary. Nobody's questioning your past abilities," Thelma said, her voice honeyed with public concern. "But we've all noticed changes." "What changes specifically?" Maxwell challenged. The table exchanged glances, a silent communication system from which he was excluded. "The forgotten appointments," Thelma's sister offered. "The misplaced keys." "The mood swings," added her mother. "The paranoia," Thelma concluded, reaching across to pat his hand. "Like right now, dear." Maxwell withdrew his hand. 37 years, and he'd never felt so alone, surrounded by people. "I haven't forgotten any appointments. I haven't misplaced my keys any more than anyone in this room. And questioning why I'm being systematically undermined isn't paranoia." "Maxwell, you're making a scene," Thelma said, voice hardening. "This is exactly what I've been trying to explain to everyone." Something in her tone, the practiced concern masking irritation, crystallized everything. Maxwell stood slowly. "I've been a husband, father, provider, and partner for nearly 4 decades, he said, looking directly at Thelma. "I deserve better than this." The slap came suddenly, Thelma's hand connecting with his cheek before anyone could react. The crack echoed in the stunned silence that followed. Maxwell's hand rose slowly to his face, feeling the sting where her palm had landed. Emma stood beside him, her small voice clear in the silence. "I have it all recorded," she announced, pulling a small device from her backpack. "This and everything else. And I already sent copies to Grandpa Mitchell." Thelma's face drained of color. "What did you say?" "Colonel Mitchell is coming," Emma continued, her 9-year-old voice steady with purpose. "And he's bringing people with him." The table erupted in panicked whispers as Maxwell looked at his daughter with newfound understanding. The watchfulness, the notebook, the careful positioning around the house. His hand found Emma's shoulder, strength flowing between them as the family that had allied against him now faced a reckoning neither had anticipated. The dining room emptied quickly, Thelma's family retreating to the living room in a flurry of urgent whispers. Only Maxwell and Emma remained at the table, the Thanksgiving feast forgotten between them. His cheek still burned from the slap, but something else burned brighter, understanding dawning like a winter sunrise. "Emma," he said softly, "let's go to your room." She nodded, gathering her backpack with the careful movements of someone carrying precious cargo. As they climbed the stairs, Maxwell heard Thelma's voice rising from below, sharp with panic, as she spoke to her mother. Emma's bedroom was a child's space transformed by purpose. Maxwell had always thought the organization unusual for a 9-year-old. Books arranged by subject, colored pencils in perfect rainbow order. Now he understood it wasn't merely preference, but methodology. She closed the door and pulled a small wooden box from beneath her bed. The kind he'd made for her last birthday, with a hidden compartment he'd designed to hold special treasures. "I have more than one recorder, Dad," she explained, opening the box to reveal 3 identical devices. "I put them in different rooms and move them around so no one notices." Maxwell sank onto the edge of her bed, overwhelmed. "How long?" "Since summer," Emma replied, sitting beside him. "When Aunt Karen said you were slipping and everyone nodded, you weren't even there, but I was. They didn't think I was listening." The betrayal he'd suspected crystallized into something harder, colder. "And your grandfather? Colonel Mitchell?" Emma's small fingers worked the recorder, finding a specific timestamp. "I call him every week. Mom thinks I'm just checking in, but I've been telling him everything. Last month, I started sending him recordings." She pressed play. Thelma's voice emerged, clear in the quiet room. "Maxwell's pension and investments would be easier to manage if we had medical documentation. Mom knows a doctor who understands these situations." Her mother's reply: "Once the paperwork's filed, the house can be transferred before he realizes, for his own protection, of course." Maxwell's hands trembled. Years as a mechanic had taught him to identify problems by sound, the particular knock of a failing piston, the whine of a bearing about to seize. Now he recognized the sound of his life being dismantled by design. "There's more," Emma said, her voice small but steady. She cycled through recordings, conversations about accounts being moved, discussions of care facilities with available openings, Thelma laughing about how easy it had been to convince his friends he was declining. Tears formed in Maxwell's eyes, but these weren't the silent tears of confusion. They burned with rage, with the particular pain of discovering the architect of your undoing is the person who once promised to stand beside you. "I didn't know what to do at first," Emma continued, pulling out a notebook filled with dates, times, and quotes in her careful handwriting. "Then I remembered Grandpa saying that evidence is how you fight back when no one believes you." Maxwell pulled her close, this child who had become his protector. Shame mingled with pride, shame that she had witnessed such betrayal, pride in her remarkable courage. "What did your grandfather say exactly?" he asked, wiping his eyes with the handkerchief she'd given him. Emma retrieved her phone from the desk drawer, a basic model Thelma had reluctantly allowed for emergencies only. "He said to get you alone after something big happened. That's why I waited until today." She scrolled through text messages. "He's already on his way. Has been since this morning." Maxwell looked at the last message. "Operation Eagle Landing, 1800 hours. Stand firm, soldier." "Eagle?" he asked. Emma almost smiled. "That's what he calls you. Says you always had the sharpest eyes in the family." A sound from the hallway made them both look up. Footsteps approached, Thelma's distinctive stride, purpose in every step. "She'll try to take my phone and recorders," Emma whispered urgently. "She always checks my room when she's mad." Maxwell stood, decision crystallizing. In the garage, where he'd rebuilt engines and repaired furniture, there was a hidden compartment in his workbench, a place Thelma had never discovered in all their years together. "Give me everything except one recorder," he said quietly. "Keep that one running." As Emma quickly transferred devices and notebooks into his waiting hands, Maxwell felt something shift inside him, grief giving way to resolve. For decades he'd fixed broken things, found solutions where others saw only problems. Now he would apply that same precision to rebuilding his life, with unexpected allies in his corner. The doorknob turned just as Maxwell slipped the evidence into his pocket. Thelma entered, her composed mask barely concealing fury beneath. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" she demanded, eyes darting between them. Maxwell straightened to his full height. "Having an honest conversation," he replied, voice steady. "Something we should have tried years ago." Behind Thelma, through the bedroom window, he caught sight of a black sedan turning onto their street, followed by another, Colonel Mitchell, right on schedule. The real conversation was just beginning. The confrontation in Emma's bedroom escalated quickly. Thelma's practiced composure fractured when Maxwell refused to hand over Emma's phone. "You're embarrassing yourself," she hissed, voice low enough that her family downstairs wouldn't hear. "This paranoid behavior is exactly what I've been trying to explain to everyone." "Is it paranoia when there's evidence?" Maxwell asked, standing firmly between Thelma and Emma. "Voice recordings of you planning to take control of our accounts, discussing care facilities, forging my handwriting?" Thelma's face paled momentarily before she recovered. "Those would be conversations about contingency planning, what any responsible spouse would do when their partner is declining. I'm not declining. The fact that you can't see it proves my point." She reached for Emma's arm. "Come downstairs now, young lady. Your father needs some time alone." Emma shrank back. "No." The single word, spoken firmly by a 9-year-old, seemed to shock Thelma more than anything else. Outside, car doors slammed, but the sound went unnoticed in the tension of the moment. "This defiance is unacceptable," Thelma said, voice rising. "Both of you will—" The doorbell rang, its chime cutting through the house. Thelma's mother called up the stairs. "Thelma, there are military men at the door asking for Maxwell." The color drained from Thelma's face. She looked from Maxwell to Emma, calculation replacing anger. "Whatever you think you're doing, this won't end well for you." She turned and hurried downstairs. Maxwell exhaled slowly, his hands still trembling with suppressed emotion. "She'll try to stop Grandpa," Emma whispered urgently. "Let's give them a minute," Maxwell replied, listening to the commotion below. "Your grandfather knows how to handle himself." Muffled voices drifted up, Thelma's protests, a deep authoritative tone that must belong to Colonel Mitchell, the concerned murmurs of Thelma's family. Emma sat on her bed, suddenly looking very much like the child she was. "Dad? Are you mad at me for not telling you sooner?" Maxwell knelt beside her, ignoring the protest in his knees. "No, sweetheart, never. You showed more courage and wisdom than most adults ever find." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "But I am worried about what you've had to see and hear." "I just wanted to protect you," she said softly, "like you always protected me." The lump in his throat made it difficult to speak. This child had witnessed the systematic dismantling of her father's dignity, and had responded not with confusion, but with methodical resistance. What had that cost her? Heavy footsteps on the stairs interrupted the moment. A knock at the door was followed by a commanding voice. "Maxwell? Emma? It's James Mitchell." The man who entered was exactly as Maxwell remembered from their infrequent family gatherings, ramrod straight despite his 67 years, silver hair cropped short, eyes that missed nothing. Behind him stood 2 younger men in civilian clothes, their military bearing unmistakable despite the absence of uniforms. "Sir," Emma said, straightening automatically. Colonel Mitchell's stern expression softened as he looked at his granddaughter. "At ease, soldier. Mission accomplished." He turned to Maxwell, extending a hand. "I wish we were meeting again under better circumstances, son." Maxwell took his father-in-law's hand, surprised by the firm grip and the emotion it conveyed. They had never been close, the pragmatic mechanic and the career military man, but now they were united by something stronger than their differences. "Thank you for coming," Maxwell said simply. The evidence Emma sent was illuminating. The colonel's jaw tightened. "We have options, but we need to move quickly. My colleagues here are from the JAG Corps, military lawyers. They've agreed to help as a personal favor." One of the men stepped forward. "Mr. Mitchell, the recordings your daughter collected would be admissible in court. Combined with the financial documentation Colonel Mitchell obtained through his connections, we have enough to file for emergency protective orders." Maxwell sank into Emma's desk chair, the magnitude of the situation overwhelming him. After months of gaslighting and isolation, having allies, having evidence, seemed almost unreal. "I never thought it would come to legal action," he admitted, voice hollow. 37 years of marriage. Has someone's betrayal ever left you questioning everything you thought was real? Share your experience below. Like if Maxwell's pain resonates with you, follow to see how he finds the strength to rebuild his life from the ashes of deception. Colonel Mitchell placed a steady hand on Maxwell's shoulder. "Sometimes the people closest to us are capable of the greatest harm. It doesn't diminish who you are or what you've built." "What happens now?" Emma asked, voice small but determined. The colonel exchanged glances with his colleagues. "Ideally, we serve Thelma with a temporary restraining order today. The financial accounts we can freeze immediately through connections I still have at the credit union." "And Emma?" Maxwell asked, the question that mattered most. "That's more complicated," one of the lawyers admitted, but given the evidence of psychological abuse and Emma's clear preference. A crash from downstairs interrupted him. Raised voices followed, Thelma demanding that someone leave, a male voice responding with official terminology. "That would be the sheriff's deputy I called," Colonel Mitchell explained. "Time to move. Emma, gather whatever you absolutely need for a few days. Maxwell, same for you." As Emma began carefully selecting items, the recorders, her notebook, a stuffed bear worn with age, Maxwell felt a wave of despair. This was his home, built with his hands and heart over decades. Now he was preparing to flee it like a refugee. "What if it's not enough?" he asked quietly. For the colonel's ears only. "What if they believe her? She's been laying this groundwork for months, maybe longer." Colonel Mitchell's eyes, so like Emma's in their clarity, met his directly. "Then we fight harder. But you're not fighting alone anymore." The simple truth of those words steadied Maxwell as they prepared to descend into the chaos below. Not alone. After months of isolation, those two words felt like a lifeline thrown into very dark waters. The next 48 hours passed in a blur of activity. Colonel Mitchell had secured rooms at a hotel near his home, neutral territory where Maxwell and Emma could gather themselves while legal machinery ground into motion. The suite, with its generic furnishings and hotel-scented air, felt simultaneously like sanctuary and exile. Maxwell sat at the small desk, reviewing documents spread before him. Financial statements, property deeds, medical records, the paper trail of a life he thought he knew. Colonel Mitchell's connections had produced these with remarkable speed, revealing the extent of Thelma's preparations. "She's been moving money for almost a year," Maxwell said, tracing a finger down account statements. His mechanic's precision, once applied to engines, now dissected the dismantling of his financial life. Small amounts at first, then larger transfers once she had the duplicate cards. Colonel Mitchell nodded, standing by the window with military posture. Classic approach. Start small to test for resistance, then escalate when none is detected. In the adjoining room, Emma sat cross-legged on the bed, headphones connected to a laptop as she reviewed her recordings with one of the JAG lawyers. Her small face remained serious, focused on the task despite its emotional weight. "She shouldn't have to do this," Maxwell said quietly, watching his daughter through the partially open door. "She's 9 years old." "No, she shouldn't," the colonel agreed. "But she chose to fight rather than watch you fall. That kind of courage doesn't come from nowhere, Maxwell. It comes from example." The compliment landed awkwardly, but Maxwell felt its truth. Whatever his failings, he had shown Emma that principles mattered, that standing up for others was worth the cost. A knock at the door announced the arrival of Catherine Weber, the civilian attorney Colonel Mitchell had engaged to lead Maxwell's case. In her 60s herself, with silver hair cut in a practical bob, she carried authority without intimidation. "Good news," she announced, setting her briefcase on the table. "Judge Franklin granted the temporary restraining order. Thelma cannot contact either of you, nor access the frozen accounts, pending our hearing next week." "And the house?" Maxwell asked. "Still complicated," Catherine admitted. "Since it's in both your names, and there's no immediate danger with Thelma restrained from contact, the judge wants more evidence before issuing an exclusive use order." Maxwell nodded, absorbing another piece of his new reality. The home he'd maintained for decades, replacing the roof himself after the '98 storms, building the deck where Emma had taken her first steps, now existed in legal limbo. "We need to prepare you both for the hearing," Catherine continued, pulling out a yellow legal pad. "Thelma's attorney filed a response claiming your cognitive decline poses a danger to Emma. They're pushing for emergency custody." Maxwell's hand trembled slightly as he reached for his coffee cup. "Using my own child against me." "Standard tactic," Catherine replied, not unkindly. "They're overreaching, which works in our favor. Emma's recordings directly contradict their narrative, and Colonel Mitchell's financial investigation shows clear intent to defraud." She turned to a fresh page in her notepad. "Maxwell, I need you to document every instance you can recall where Thelma or her family suggested you were confused, forgetful, or otherwise impaired. Dates, witnesses, context, anything you remember." For the next hour, Maxwell reconstructed months of subtle undermining, comments at family gatherings, Thelma helpfully taking over bill payments, friends who had begun treating him differently after speaking with Thelma. Each memory brought fresh pain, but also clarity, the scattered puzzle pieces forming a coherent picture of deliberate isolation. "They'll bring character witnesses," Catherine warned. "Family members, possibly friends, who've been fed her version of events." "What about my sister?" Maxwell asked. "Jane knows me better than anyone except Emma." Colonel Mitchell, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. "Already contacted her. She's flying in tomorrow, furious about being manipulated." A weight lifted from Maxwell's chest. Jane, his practical-minded sister who could spot deception at 20 paces. Another ally he hadn't realized was still in his corner. As evening approached, Emma emerged from her session with the JAG lawyer, looking tired but resolute. She carried her notebook and a fresh stack of transcribed recordings. "We found a good one, Dad," she said, placing a printed transcript before him. "From last month, when Mom was talking to Grandma about the doctor who would sign papers without actually examining you." Maxwell read the transcript, his heart sinking at the clinical way his wife of nearly 4 decades discussed having him declared incompetent. The final line hit hardest. "Once it's official, we can move forward with everything else." Maxwell won't know what hit him. Your recorder caught all this? He asked, amazed at the clarity of the transcription. Emma nodded. I put them where people talk most. The kitchen, Mom's office, the living room when family visits. Catherine reviewed the transcript, making notes. This is excellent. Shows clear premeditation and intent to exploit. Emma, your testimony about where and when you placed these recordings will be crucial. For the first time, Emma looked uncertain. Will I have to talk in court? With Mom there? The adults exchanged glances. Colonel Mitchell moved to sit beside his granddaughter, his military bearing softening. Possibly, sweetheart, but you won't be alone. I'm not scared of her, Emma said quickly. I just don't want to mess up. Maxwell felt a surge of pride mixed with sorrow. No child should have to testify against a parent. No child should have to document abuse to protect a parent. Yet here they were, preparing for exactly that. You won't mess up, he assured her. Just tell the truth, like you've been doing all along. Catherine began packing her materials. We have 3 days to prepare. The hearing is Wednesday morning. Colonel, can you continue gathering financial documentation? I want to show the judge exactly how systematic this was. As plans formed around him, Maxwell felt something he hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Not just the absence of despair, but actual, tangible hope. The machinery of justice was complex and imperfect, but it was moving in his favor. Later that night, after Emma had finally fallen asleep in the hotel room's second bed, Maxwell stood at the window, looking out at the unfamiliar city lights. Colonel Mitchell joined him, offering a cup of coffee. She's a remarkable child, the colonel said quietly. Yes, Maxwell agreed. Too remarkable for what she's had to become. Children adapt to their environments. Some break under pressure. Others, like Emma, find strength they didn't know they had. The colonel sipped his coffee. Like their parents, Maxwell turned to his father-in-law, this man he had never truly known during his marriage. Why are you doing all this? We've never been close. Colonel Mitchell's expression remained composed, but something flickered in his eyes. I failed my daughter somewhere along the way, couldn't give her what she needed, whatever that was, but I won't fail my granddaughter. He paused. Or you, your family, Maxwell, the kind worth fighting for. The simple declaration, delivered without sentiment, but with absolute conviction, steadied Maxwell for what lay ahead. Family, not defined by Thelma's manipulation or her relatives' complicity, but by those who stood beside you when the foundations shook. Tomorrow would bring more preparation, more painful revelations, more strategic planning. But tonight, watching over Emma's sleep while Colonel Mitchell kept silent vigil nearby, Maxwell allowed himself to believe that the life they would rebuild might be stronger than the one that had been dismantled. The county courthouse loomed before them, its stone facade imposing against the morning sky. Maxwell adjusted his tie, the blue one Jane had brought yesterday, insisting it brought out the determination in his eyes. Beside him, Emma stood in a simple dress, her recorder collection and notebook secured in the backpack clutched against her chest. Colonel Mitchell approached from the parking area, accompanied by Catherine Weber and Jane. The colonel's civilian clothes couldn't disguise his military bearing, just as Jane's calm exterior couldn't fully hide her simmering anger at what her brother had endured. Remember, Catherine said quietly as they gathered at the courthouse steps, Thelma's attorney will try to provoke emotional responses. Stay calm, answer only what's asked, and let the evidence speak for itself. Has someone's betrayal forced you to stand up and fight for your dignity? Share your journey in the comments. Like if Maxwell's courage inspires you, follow to witness the powerful confrontation as this family faces their moment of truth. Maxwell nodded, his throat tight. The past 3 days of preparation had been exhausting but clarifying. Each financial record, each transcribed recording, each documented incident had transformed his pain into purpose. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about Emma's future and the truth itself. "They're already inside," Colonel Mitchell reported, checking his watch with military precision. Thelma, her parents, her sister, and their attorney arrived 15 minutes ago. Maxwell felt Emma's small hand slip into his. "Ready, Dad?" she asked, her voice steadier than her 9 years should allow. "As I'll ever be," he answered honestly. As they climbed the courthouse steps, Maxwell caught sight of a familiar figure waiting near the entrance, Robert Chen, his friend of 20 years and former colleague from the auto shop. The man who had stopped calling after speaking with Thelma about Maxwell's supposed confusion. Robert approached hesitantly, guilt evident in his posture. "Max, I didn't know. She told me you were having episodes, forgetting things, that you didn't want visitors because it was embarrassing for you." The explanation hung in the air between them, an offering and a confession. Maxwell felt the weight of each relationship Thelma had poisoned, each friendship she had methodically severed to isolate him. "Are you here to testify?" Maxwell asked, neither accepting nor rejecting the implicit apology. Robert nodded. "For you, Catherine contacted me yesterday. I brought documentation from when we restored that '67 Mustang last spring, the wiring diagrams you drew from memory when the manual was missing. No one with cognitive issues could have done that." Another piece of evidence, another ally reclaimed from Thelma's web of manipulation. Maxwell nodded his thanks, unable to fully process this unexpected support. Inside, the courthouse hallway bustled with morning activity. Catherine directed them to a small conference room where they could gather themselves before the hearing. As they walked, Maxwell felt eyes following them. Court staff, other attorneys, people who had no idea of the private war being waged in their midst. They had almost reached the conference room when Thelma's voice cut through the hallway noise. "Emma, sweetheart!" Maxwell turned to see Thelma approaching, her attorney trying to restrain her with urgent whispers. She wore the blue dress Maxwell had always complimented, her hair and makeup perfect, her expression a masterpiece of maternal concern. Emma's hand tightened in Maxwell's as Catherine stepped between them and Thelma. "Mrs. Mitchell, you're violating the temporary restraining order," Catherine said firmly. "Return to your attorney immediately." Thelma's performance didn't falter. "I just want to see my daughter." "Emma, honey, are you okay? Are they taking care of you?" Emma didn't respond, her face composed in a way no child should need to be. Colonel Mitchell moved forward, positioning himself like a shield. "Step back, Thelma," he said, voice low, but carrying the unmistakable tone of command. "You're making a scene that won't help your case." For a moment, Thelma's mask slipped, frustration flashing across her features before the concerned mother persona returned. "Dad, surely you can see what's happening here. Maxwell's paranoia has gotten worse, and now he's influenced Emma." "Save it for the hearing," Colonel Mitchell interrupted, "where Emma's recordings can speak for themselves." The mention of recordings rippled through Thelma's carefully constructed facade. Her eyes darted to Emma's backpack, calculation replacing concern. "This is ridiculous," she said, voice hardening slightly. "A few out-of-context recordings made by a confused child." "Mrs. Mitchell," Catherine interjected, Every word you're saying is being witnessed by court personnel. I suggest you return to your attorney before you further damage your position." Thelma's attorney finally managed to guide her away, whispering urgently in her ear as they retreated down the hallway. Maxwell released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Well done, Emma," Jane said softly, kneeling to her niece's level. "You didn't say a word." "She wanted me to," Emma replied with surprising insight. "She wanted me to look confused or scared so she could say I was being manipulated." Catherine nodded approvingly. "Exactly right. Now, let's get settled before we're called in." In the small conference room, Maxwell tried to center himself as final preparations were made. Catherine reviewed key points of testimony. Colonel Mitchell organized the financial documentation one last time. Jane helped Emma arrange her recordings in chronological order, each labeled with dates and locations. A court officer appeared at the door. "Weber party? Judge Franklin is ready for you." As they gathered their materials, Maxwell felt a moment of paralyzing doubt. What if the judge believed Thelma's performance? What if decades of marriage carried more weight than Emma's recordings? What if the system designed to protect the vulnerable failed them? Emma seemed to sense his hesitation. She looked up at him, her expression serious beyond her years. "Remember what you told me when I was learning to ride my bike?" she asked. "Even if you fall, you get back up and keep pedaling," Maxwell finished, the memory warming him. "When did you get so wise, little one?" "I had a good teacher," she replied simply. Together, they walked toward the courtroom, toward the confrontation that would determine their future. Maxwell straightened his shoulders, drawing strength from the unlikely alliance surrounding him. His daughter, his sister, his father-in-law, his friend, his attorney. For months, Thelma had worked to convince him and everyone else that he was weak, confused, incapable. Today would tell a different story. The family courtroom was smaller than Maxwell had imagined, its wood-paneled walls creating an intimacy that felt both comforting and intimidating. Judge Franklin, a woman in her 60s with silver-streaked hair and penetrating eyes, presided from a modest bench rather than an elevated platform. The arrangement made the proceedings feel more like a serious conversation than a theatrical performance, which, Catherine had explained, was precisely Judge Franklin's intention. Thelma and her attorney sat at one table, her parents and sister in the row directly behind them. Maxwell noticed how Thelma had positioned herself to appear vulnerable yet dignified, hands clasped before her, expression conveying nothing but concern. As their group settled at the opposite table, Maxwell felt Emma's presence beside him like a tether to reality. Whatever happened in this room, the truth existed in those recordings and in his daughter's steadfast belief in him. "All rise," the clerk announced as Judge Franklin entered. The proceedings began with opening statements. Thelma's attorney, a polished man in his 40s named Lawrence Brennan, painted a compelling picture of a concerned wife watching her husband's cognitive decline, taking necessary steps to protect family assets and their daughter's well-being. Mrs. Mitchell's actions, while perhaps seeming controlling when viewed through the distorted lens of paranoia, were motivated solely by love and protection, Brennan concluded. "Will demonstrate that Mr. Mitchell's recent behavior, including influencing their 9-year-old daughter to spy on her mother, represents precisely the concerning judgment that necessitated Mrs. Mitchell's intervention." When Catherine rose for her opening, her approach struck a different tone entirely, direct, evidence-focused, and unembellished. "Your Honor, this case is about systematic gaslighting and financial exploitation, documented not through hearsay, but through Mrs. Mitchell's own recorded words and financial records. We will demonstrate that Mrs. Mitchell fabricated concerns about Mr. Mitchell's cognitive abilities as a pretext for seizing control of assets and removing him from their home. The recordings made by their daughter Emma were not the result of parental manipulation, but a child's desperate attempt to protect her father when all other adults had been deceived. Judge Franklin listened impassively to both statements before addressing the attorneys. Given the presence of a minor whose welfare is central to these proceedings, I'll be conducting this hearing somewhat differently. I want to review the key evidence before subjecting Emma Mitchell to questioning. Thelma's attorney began to object, but Judge Franklin raised her hand. Mr. Brennan, I understand your concerns about due process. You'll have full opportunity to cross-examine, but I want to establish the factual context first. Catherine presented the financial documentation first. Bank records showing systematic transfers from joint accounts to accounts in Thelma's name alone. Correspondence with a retirement community that specialized in memory care, initiated months before any supposed incidents of confusion. A consultation with an attorney specializing in guardianship, paid for from the joint account, but never mentioned to Maxwell. Judge Franklin reviewed each document carefully, occasionally asking clarifying questions. Maxwell watched Thelma's expression grow increasingly rigid as the financial trail unfolded before the court. Then came the recordings. The first was from 3 months earlier, Thelma speaking to her mother in the kitchen. Dr. Grayson says he can do the evaluation without Maxwell even realizing what it's for. Just a routine checkup that happens to include cognitive screening. Once we have that documentation, everything else falls into place. Her mother's voice. And if the screening doesn't show anything? Thelma's laugh. With the right leading questions and documentation of incidents, it will. Besides, who's going to believe him over me at that point? As the recording played, Thelma's mask of concern crumbled momentarily before she recovered, leaning to whisper urgently to her attorney. Judge Franklin's expression remained neutral, but her eyes narrowed slightly. Catherine played 5 more recordings in sequence, each damning in its calculated discussion of how to undermine Maxwell's independence, reputation, and legal standing. In one particularly disturbing clip, Thelma could be heard coaching her sister on how to casually mention Maxwell's confusion to mutual friends. The goal is to create a consistent narrative, Thelma explained on the recording. So when the time comes, everyone will say they noticed it too. When the recordings concluded, the courtroom sat in heavy silence. Judge Franklin turned her attention to Emma, who sat straight-backed beside Maxwell. Emma, the judge said gently, I need to ask you some questions now. You're not in any trouble, but I need to understand how these recordings were made. Emma nodded solemnly. Did anyone tell you to make these recordings? No, Your Honor, Emma replied clearly. I started because I kept hearing Mom and Grandma saying Dad was confused or forgetting things, but he wasn't. I thought, if I had proof, someone would believe us. How did you know to record these conversations? Emma's answer was disarmingly straightforward. We learned about documentation in school. For science experiments, you have to record what happens exactly. And Grandpa Mitchell always says that evidence is how you prove what's true when people don't believe you. Judge Franklin nodded, her expression softening slightly. And did you tell your father about the recordings right away? Not until Thanksgiving, Emma explained. I was afraid Mom would find them if Dad knew, so I kept them secret until... She hesitated, looking at Maxwell. Until what, Emma? Judge Franklin prompted gently. Until Mom slapped Dad at dinner for standing up for himself, Emma finished, her voice smaller but still clear. That's when I knew I had to tell. Judge Franklin turned to Thelma, whose composed facade had noticeably cracked. "Mrs. Mitchell, would you like to respond to what we've heard?" Thelma leaned toward her microphone, voice modulated to convey reasonableness. "Your Honor, isolated comments taken out of context by a child who doesn't understand adult concerns can sound quite different from their intent. My husband's behavior had become increasingly erratic." "Specifically how?" Judge Franklin interrupted. Thelma faltered momentarily. "Forgetting appointments, misplacing things, becoming defensive when offered help." "Can you provide the dates and details of these incidents?" I didn't keep a record, Your Honor. I was too concerned with protecting, yet your daughter, only 9 years old, managed to keep quite detailed records," Judge Franklin observed, "including dates, times, and locations of each recording." The questioning continued for another hour, methodical, precise, and increasingly difficult for Thelma to navigate, as her claims of Maxwell's cognitive decline collided with contradictory evidence. Robert Chen testified about the complex restoration work Maxwell had completed just months earlier. Jane presented text messages from Thelma discouraging her from visiting due to Maxwell's supposed embarrassment over his condition. Throughout it all, Maxwell watched the careful construction of his wife's deception disassemble piece by piece. The pain remained, 37 years of marriage revealed as a relationship he hadn't fully understood, but something else grew alongside it: vindication. Judge Franklin called a brief recess before delivering her ruling. In the hallway, Catherine squeezed Maxwell's arm reassuringly. "You did well," she said. "So did Emma. The financial evidence alone would likely have been enough, but the recordings make the intent unmistakable." When they returned to the courtroom, Judge Franklin didn't waste time on preamble. "Based on the evidence presented, I am extending the temporary restraining order for 6 months. During this period, Mrs. Mitchell is to have no contact with Mr. Mitchell or Emma except through counsel. The financial accounts will remain frozen pending a full accounting by a court-appointed financial guardian." She turned her attention directly to Thelma. "Mrs. Mitchell, the evidence strongly suggests an orchestrated attempt to have your husband declared incompetent for financial gain. I am referring this matter to the district attorney's office for potential criminal investigation." Thelma's composure finally shattered. "This is absurd. I was protecting our family." "Mrs. Mitchell," Judge Franklin replied firmly, "the court has heard your own voice describing how to manipulate medical evaluations and isolate your husband from his support system. That is not protection, it is abuse." Turning to Maxwell, her tone softened slightly. "Mr. Mitchell, I am granting you temporary full custody of Emma with exclusive use of the family home. Mrs. Mitchell will have 48 hours to remove personal belongings under supervision." As the judge continued outlining the terms of her ruling, Maxwell felt Emma's hand slip into his. The road ahead would not be easy. Divorce proceedings, potential criminal charges, helping Emma process the fracturing of her family. But they would face it together, with truth finally on their side. Colonel Mitchell's steady presence behind them, Jane's hand on his shoulder, Robert's nod of support from across the room. These formed a constellation of allies, where Thelma had tried to create a vacuum. When the judge finally adjourned the hearing, Thelma was escorted out by her attorney, her family trailing behind in stunned silence. The carefully constructed narrative they had all participated in had collapsed under the weight of Emma's simple, devastating truth. Outside the courtroom, in the momentary quiet of the hallway, Maxwell knelt to Emma's level, finding himself without adequate words to express what her courage had meant. "You saved me," he said simply. Emma's serious face brightened with the first genuine smile he'd seen in months. "We saved each other, Dad." In that moment, as Colonel Mitchell and Jane made arrangements for their return home, Maxwell understood that while one chapter of his life had ended in betrayal, another had begun in truth, built on a foundation stronger than the one that had been lost. 3 years later, the porch swing creaked gently as Maxwell pushed it with his foot, watching the summer sunset paint the sky in shades of amber and violet. The house, their house now, legally and emotionally, had transformed along with their lives. New curtains, rearranged furniture, walls repainted in brighter colors, all Emma's choices as she helped reclaim the space that had once felt like a stage set for Thelma's performance. At 12, Emma had grown taller, her face losing some of its childish roundness, but retaining the serious eyes that had seen too much, too young. She sat cross-legged on the porch steps, talking quietly with Lily, a classmate who had started visiting regularly over the past month. Maxwell pretended not to eavesdrop, but he couldn't help noticing the familiar pattern of their conversation, Emma asking careful questions, Lily responding with increasing trust. "Dad?" Emma called, turning toward him. "Can Lily stay for dinner? Uncle Robert's coming too, right?" "Of course she can," Maxwell replied, smiling at the quiet girl. "There's plenty of lasagna." As the girls disappeared inside to wash up, Maxwell remained on the swing, fingers absently tracing the wooden armrest he'd refinished last fall. The past 3 years had unfolded in ways he could never have predicted that Thanksgiving Day when everything changed. Thelma had eventually pleaded guilty to reduced charges of financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. A bitter irony, given her fabricated concerns about Maxwell's competence. The plea deal had spared Emma from testifying at a criminal trial, for which Maxwell was profoundly grateful. Thelma received probation, mandatory counseling, and a restitution order that would take years to fulfill. Her family had scattered back to their separate lives, the unified front crumbling once their complicity was exposed. Only Thelma's sister had eventually reached out, sending a heartfelt letter of apology to both Maxwell and Emma. The reconciliation remained tentative, but it was something, a small bridge across the chasm Thelma had created. The divorce had been finalized 18 months ago, the proceedings more procedural than emotional by that point. Maxwell had felt many things signing those papers: regret, relief, resignation, but not the devastating loss he might once have expected. The true loss had happened long before, in small, accumulated betrayals he hadn't recognized until Emma showed him the pattern. Colonel Mitchell visited regularly now, his military rigidity softening around Emma. He had retired completely, using his newfound time to establish a foundation helping victims of elder abuse navigate legal systems. Maxwell assisted occasionally, sharing his story when it might help others recognize the warning signs he had missed. The screen door opened as Robert Chen stepped onto the porch, carrying 2 cups of coffee. In the aftermath of the hearing, Robert had become a fixture in their lives again. Sunday dinners, fishing trips with Emma, helping Maxwell restore classic cars in the garage workshop that had become a small but thriving business. "Thought you could use this," Robert said, handing Maxwell a steaming mug. "Girls plotting something in there. Lots of whispers and serious faces." Maxwell accepted the coffee with a grateful nod. "Lily's mom is dating someone new. From what I can gather, he's got a bit of a temper." Understanding dawned on Robert's face. "And Emma's in full protection mode. She recognizes the signs," Maxwell said quietly. "Sometimes I worry that she took on too much, too young. that she feels responsible for fixing broken things. Wonder where she gets that from, Robert replied with a knowing look. Maxwell had spent decades fixing engines, furniture, appliances, anything that could be restored with patience and the right tools. The difference is, I work on objects, not people. Robert leaned against the porch railing. That's not entirely true. You helped me rebuild my life after Diana left. You're helping Colonel Mitchell with his foundation. You gave Jane a place to stay during her renovation. You fix people by believing in them, Max. Emma's just following your example. The observation settled over Maxwell like the evening's approaching warmth. Perhaps there was truth in it, that Emma's protective instincts, while triggered by trauma, were shaped by something positive she had learned from him. The girls emerged from the house, Emma carrying a notebook that Maxwell recognized, similar to the one she had used to document Thelma's behavior, but newer, its purpose now transformed. "Dad," Emma said, her voice carrying the careful weight of someone broaching a difficult subject. "Lily needs to talk to Colonel Mitchell about some stuff that's happening at home. I told her how he helped us." Maxwell met Lily's anxious gaze, recognizing the particular mix of fear and hope he had seen in so many faces at the foundation. "I think that's a very good idea. We can call him after dinner." Relief softened Lily's expression as Emma led her back inside to help set the table. Robert watched them go, shaking his head slightly. "That kid of yours is something else, Max." "She is," Maxwell agreed, feeling the familiar swell of pride tinged with lingering sadness for what had necessitated Emma's premature wisdom. As twilight deepened around them, Maxwell reflected on the journey that had brought them here. The betrayal had been devastating, the recovery arduous, but something unexpected had emerged from the wreckage of his marriage, a deeper connection with Emma, genuine friendships unburdened by manipulation, and a sense of purpose that extended beyond his own healing. The family photo that had once sat on the mantel, Maxwell and Thelma smiling stiffly with a young Emma between them, had been replaced by new images, Emma and Maxwell with Jane at her 50th birthday celebration, Colonel Mitchell teaching Emma to fish, Robert and Maxwell beside a restored '65 Thunderbird with Emma perched proudly on the hood. Family, Maxwell had learned, wasn't defined by legal documents or shared names. It was built in moments of truth, in standing together through storms, in the quiet understanding that passed between people who had seen each other at their most vulnerable and chosen to remain. Inside, the sounds of dinner preparation grew louder. Emma instructing Lily on the proper way to toss a salad, Robert rummaging for plates in cabinets he knew as well as his own. Maxwell took a final moment alone on the porch, watching as the first stars appeared in the deepening blue sky. "We made it," he whispered to the evening air, to himself, to the memory of the man he had been 3 years ago, terrified and alone, unable to see a path forward. The screen door opened again, Emma's voice calling him to dinner. Maxwell rose from the swing, leaving behind the ghosts of what had been lost, and walking toward the warm light of what had been found. A different kind of family, a different kind of home, a different kind of happiness than he had ever imagined possible. As he stepped inside, Emma's hand slipped naturally into his, a habit that had survived from those darkest days, now transformed into something that comforted them both. In that simple touch lingered the truth that had saved them. Sometimes the greatest strength comes not from standing alone, but from knowing whose hand to hold when the world shifts beneath your feet. Folks, we've all sat alone with betrayal at some point, haven't we? That moment when trust shatters like fine china on a kitchen floor. When someone you've loved for decades reveals themselves a stranger. That first tear that falls when you realize the life you built has been undermined while you weren't looking. Truth is, at our age, betrayal cuts deeper. After years of building a life, the mortgage payments, the children raised, the silent sacrifices, discovering deception feels like the cruelest joke. Your heart, lined with decades of experience, still breaks with surprising ease. But here's what I've learned, darling. The same wisdom that recognizes betrayal becomes your strength in rebuilding. Maxwell's mechanic's eyes didn't just see engines clearly. They eventually saw truth. And the expertise you've gathered over decades doesn't vanish because someone says it has. The porch swing might creak differently now. The coffee might taste stronger in morning light that falls across a table set for fewer people. But there's peace in authenticity that false harmony never provided. Your dignity wasn't in maintaining appearances, but in finding the strength to let them fall away. Your story isn't over, not by a long measure.